Hello and good evening, everybody. It's me, Julian, and today I would like to provide you with a short lecture of sorts titled The Radical Inadequacy of Reality, which is also going to serve as a basic introduction to the Zizekian Lacanian concept of fantasy. And I'd like to begin with a really seemingly simple question, namely, fantasy, what is it? Which is to say, it's not enough to say that something is a fantasy because we desire it or because we escape into it. Like the commonplace definition of fantasy as being the opposite of reality, that which we escape into if we can no longer bear reality, is insufficient. In fact, Kant was perhaps the first to really articulate this problem. The thing that drove Kant crazy was that we can never access positive reality directly, like objects in themselves. Kant's basic problem was this: why is it that every time we try to subjectively, i.e. on a particular level, engage with universal reality, we always already superimpose upon it, a priori, in advance, conceptual ideas, a phantasmatic framework, if you will. In other words, I don't just grab a clock, I'm also grabbing the idea of clock. And on the one hand, this allows us to engage with the world around us. Like if I picked up these sunglasses and I had no idea of what the sun was, then I wouldn't understand what sunglasses were for. But Kant really struggled with this because he said, if the task of philosophy is to engage with essence or the universal, which is not a mystical metaphysical place, but reality in its non-mediated universal stance, then why is it irreducible that we subject upon it phantasmatic frameworks, concepts? And for Kant, this was an irreducible issue. Like we could not overcome it. There was an irreducible barrier between subjective reason and the idea of things in themselves, universal reality. This is what you might call the radical inadequacy of reality, which is that it doesn't simply speak for itself. It must always be spoken for. It must always be mediated through conceptual reason. Of course, this Kantian problematic emerges in new form with certain sort of liberal democratic attitudes towards the idea of truth, that truth should speak for itself, the facts should speak for themselves, when in fact, the opposite is true. The facts have to be articulated. Truth does not speak for itself unless we speak for it, etc. Now, what does this have to do with fantasy? Well, Kant is already articulating a certain theory of fantasy, which said we impose concepts upon reality so as to access reality. But another word for these concepts is basically to call them fantasy. Like it's a subjective fantasy that we impose upon reality. This desk at which I'm sitting is a place where I read and work and write. These are all phantasmatic frames that I impose upon the idea of work. And Zizek, of course, to briefly bring in Zizek's adaptation of this Lacanian theory of fantasy is to say that the central phantasmatic framework that we all exist in is in fact ideology. Ideology is therefore nothing more and nothing less than a kind of pre-existing structural schematic that grants us access to a certain conception of reality based on a pre-packaged phantasmatic framework. And of course, for Zizek, the predominant prepackaged phantasmatic framework is capitalism. It gives us access to reality because we see things in terms of their use value. We see them as commodities. In fact, according to what you might call biopolitics, we even see ourselves as commodities having use value to be invested in, and so on and so forth. But to take a step back, the radical inadequacy of reality therefore implies that we can only access reality through fantasy. And Kant saw this as a massive shortcoming of reality, as a problem that couldn't be overcome. Like Kant basically believed that philosophy was broken. And Lacan argues, to make a massive leap, Lacan argues that what appears to be a problem is in fact its own solution, which is to say, fantasy isn't that which stands against reality. Fantasy is how we access reality, which is to say fantasy is co-constitutive to reality as such. In fact, you could even argue that the empty universal of reality, the radical inadequacy of reality, is in fact necessary for the subject to emerge in its own universality. Now, what is the subject's own universality? Here it helps to have a basic understanding of what Lacan calls différance, which is a certain structural antagonism that exists both between the particular subject and the universal empty place of reality, the universal, but is also mirrored within the subject itself. Now, that's really abstract, so let me try to re-articulate that. Kant says, the problem is that we can't access universal reality. We have to superimpose upon it subjective particular reason, i.e. a phantasmatic framework. Lacan argues against this, that there is no a priori universal reality. This is itself the ultimate phantasmatic frame, the lie that tells the truth, as it were. To give you an example from Lacanian psychoanalysis where you can see the same working, think about voyeurism. Voyeurism isn't simply the gaze upon the secret object. Instead, voyeurism is the gaze as secret object. And Lacan makes the same argument apropos Kantian ontology. It's not simply that we have the particular who stands against universal reality. It's not that the particular is the problem, the imminent barrier against which universal reality stands. It is that universal reality is itself the problem, is itself the particular subjective stance or the ultimate lie. Kant basically, therefore, decries traditional ontology and philosophy, declares it totally dead and defunct. He says the idea of essence, the idea of things in themselves, universal reality, etc., is itself a subjective superimposition, if you will, the ultimate fantasy. To give you a different image, imagine for a moment that we have the famous allegory of the cave, and that we realize that the ultimate projection upon the cave walls is in fact the idea that you have already escaped the cave and that you are outside. In other words, what if the fantasy of escaping the cave is itself the fantasy that makes you remain stuck within the cave? But let's take a step back, because what's crucial here, and what I haven't explained yet, is that, and this is something that Zizek points out in his book, The Parallax Gap, is that here we have an inversion that takes place by which the antagonism or difference between two things, which appears to be irreducible at first hand, turns out to be transposed into their core content, what in Hegelian terms you would call concrete universality. For example, remember the voyeur? The voyeur isn't simply the gaze upon the secret, but it is the gaze as secret. Now, you could say the same thing is true with the hedonist, and here you can see Lacan's consistency. The hedonist undergoes a transition from pleasure is my duty towards duty is my pleasure. Pleasure is my duty becomes duty is my pleasure. In other words, duty, which seems to stand against pleasure, becomes its own or ultimate pleasure. Or to give you another example, the father within Lacanian Freudian psychoanalysis is the agent of prohibition. The key aspect here is that for the child to be truly free of the father isn't simply to negate the prohibition, but to negate the father as libidinal object. In other words, the libidinal object of the prohibition as such, which the child enjoys. In other words, the child, to be fully mature, must escape not just the prohibition of the father, but must escape the desire by which he enjoys the prohibition of the father. Turgenev, actually a total non sequitur, but Turgenev has a wonderful story that illustrates this quite well. It's called Young Love, in which a young man falls in love with a woman, but secretly the most erotic writing is apropos the father, which is to say the young man admires the woman from a distance, but he really is in love with the father, until he realizes that secretly his father has been having an affair with the young woman of his affection. And at that point, the father both literally and figuratively dies, which is to say the father is no longer the agent of prohibition who stands against his amorous intent. Instead, the father is the very embodiment of this amorous intent. And so he is sublimated, as it were. He is cast out, and the man enters into adult life. Now, let me return for a moment, because I'm getting off topic. We're talking about the radical inadequacy of reality, which for Kant and Plato already was the problem by which we can't access reality directly. We always superimpose upon it a subjective framework. I've already introduced how within Lacanian psychoanalysis, the idea is that fantasy doesn't stand against reality, but is co-constitutive to it. The problem here, as I already pointed out, is that it nevertheless seems to uphold the idea of universal reality. It simply escapes the problem by means of what appears to be a mere sophism. Well, we can't access universal reality, but we can impose a fantasy frame on it, therefore we can make do. But that's really not the point, and this is where actually Zizek's reading is quite important. Let me put it as clearly as I can. Zizek says, the empty space of universality cannot be filled by the particular, but is the space of the radical non-coincidence of the particular with itself. Very abstract, but really key. What Zizek means is the empty space of the universal, which is to say, the realization that the idea of reality on a universal level is itself a phantasmatic framework, cannot be filled in or transcended by the particular. There is no transcendental space that the particular can reach that essentially allows him to be absolved from this problem. Instead, the only thing which is universal is the non-coincidence of the particular subject with itself, which is to say, the subject can't access universal reality, but moreover, the subject can't access himself or itself. The subject is irreducibly bound to conceptual reason inasmuch as the idea of universality is, which is to say the subject must create reality as an object of desire, i.e. as that which is attached to a phantasmatic frame, so as to exist itself. Hence, the subject is irreducibly attached to what is therefore essentially its own impossibility, masquerading as the stage of its possibility, which is another way of saying that the subject convinces itself that it exists against the backdrop of the supposedly immutable existence of objective universal reality. And this paradox cannot be overcome. This is, in fact, not even a paradox. It is, strictly speaking, according to Zizek, a parallax gap. It is the process by which the supposedly irredeemable barrier between the particular subject and the universal substance turns out to be the missing space of the universal itself, a kind of constitutive void, which Lacan calls the real. And against this backdrop, the subject can access social and indeed universal reality. And this is what Zizek calls the radical inadequacy of reality. Reality is never enough. It can never be universal. It can never be actually here. It must always be mediated by some subjective framework. And yet this very subjective framework is what creates actual existing reality. Now, to conclude, the most important thing here is that we don't succumb to some mysticist reworking of Lacan and Hegel, which is to say this is specifically not meant to imply that nothing is real and everything is relative and imagined, because at that point we can simply go back and say, well, these sunglasses are real. How could you deny that they're real? They're not mere concepts. The problem isn't real versus unreal. The problem is, how is the very idea of reality itself always subject to conceptual reason? And can we go beyond this? Can we forgo it? And this reveals that the classic Kantian Platonic stance is the mystical one. It's the idea that we can transcend this phantasmatic framework so as to access some noumenal object of pure universality. Against this, the Hegelian, Lacanian, Zizekian gesture is essentially materialist, which is to say, objects are not simply material objects, but they are always infused, if you will, with the subjective stance. To introduce another layer of complexity here, the material stance is never that by which a material reality is juxtaposed with a supposedly mystical transcendental one. No, the material stance, from a Marxist perspective, is the process by which even, and perhaps precisely, supposedly mute material real objects are themselves always already pre-mediated through conceptual frameworks and reason. Hence, the Marxist materialist attitude is that reality is always suspicious, that the material world is never as neutral or as objective as it seems. Therefore, the task of philosophy becomes not simply the transcendence or the leaving behind of the subjective point of view, but instead to demystify the very supposed objective neutral reality of the material around us. And this is what you might call concrete universality, the process by which the universal itself appears to us not only as radically inadequate, but as ideologically suspicious and tainted in advance. That the things as they are have to be questioned. Why and how do they appear supposedly eternally thus? Hence, the reason that Zizek is so interested in this Lacanian Hegelian idea of fantasy isn't simply an ontological problem, which would be purely abstract. It's also a way of reconfiguring the very task or project of philosophy, to make philosophy the process by which we ask a seemingly simple question. Why and how does reality appear to us as it currently does? And therefore, how can this reality be changed? Because the simple conclusion is that if reality is structured like a fantasy, which is different from saying that it is structured by a fantasy, it is structured like a fantasy, i.e. co-constitutively imposed by subjective reason, then it can be changed. Which is to say, reality can be changed. This is the radical insight of post-Hegelian metaphysics. Reality can be changed if one changes the phantasmatic frame. And this isn't simply to say, oh, we can all believe it and make it true, and together we can make it happen. Instead, it is the simple insight that reality is what we make it. That reality is a subjective frame upon the world. And that if we change what we believe is possible, we therefore imminently change our reality, our lived social circumstances. And that means that the Lacanian Zizekian theory of fantasy is inherently empowering, inherently emancipatory. It's about saying we're not simply the Kantian subject who is irredeemably lost behind the barrier of subjective reason. No, it is precisely the opposite. It is that once we realize that the very idea of a neutral objective reality that is unchangeable and unknowable is itself a subjective superposition, then we can change it, then we can know it, and in so doing, perhaps we even know ourselves. And so the radical inadequacy of reality reveals itself to be an emancipatory possibility for the emergence of a self-transparent subject. And perhaps this idea of self-transparency is not only the ideal of the Cartesian cogito, but in disguise and in reverse, what we might call a true universal. In other words, the ideal of philosophy itself. Thank you so much for listening to this arguably, understandably very dense lecture. But I really do hope that if you've stuck it out to the end, it's because you are somebody who enjoys this kind of stuff. If you'd like to follow in my lectures, if you'd like to download my lectures, if you'd like to download my ebooks that try to explain this in written form, please do consider becoming a patron. I will see you there. Thank you for listening.